Did Muhammad perform miracles? Did he demonstrate his divine authority by bringing signs and wonders? According to the Quran, no. According to most Muslims today, yes. Why do so many Muslims believe the exact opposite of what Allah says in the Quran? A vision. And we can't ignore the fact that the Quran repeatedly insists that Muhammad couldn't perform miracles. But what about Muhammad splitting the moon? Surah 54, verses 1 to 3. The hour draws nigh, and the moon is split asunder. But if they see a sign, they turn aside and say, magic, continuous. And they call it a lie, and follow their lusts. But every matter is settled. So, where does this say Muhammad did anything? It doesn't. But this is another instance where later Muslim sources claim that Muhammad performed a miracle. These much later sources say that the pagans challenged Muhammad to split the moon. Muhammad accepted the challenge and split the moon right in front of the pagans. This should make us wonder why the Quran is filled with verses about pagans asking why Muhammad never came with miracles, even though he supposedly split the moon in front of them. But there's another problem here. Muslims can't even agree on what Surah 54 verse 1 is talking about. The Halim translation says, the hour draws near, the moon is split. But there's a note, which reads, one of the signs of the day of judgment. The Arabic uses the past tense as if that day were already here to help the reader, listener, imagine how it will be. Some traditional commentators hold the view that this describes an actual event at the time of the prophet, but it clearly refers to the end of the world. And the Quran uses similar language about the end of the world elsewhere. So, some Muslims believe this has absolutely nothing to do with Muhammad splitting the moon. It's about the Day of Judgment.
Faster than you can say mental hospitals disable dead kids and hammers. David Wood keeps bringing up already refuted arguments against Islam and the Prophet Muhammad. Now, notice in the video David Wood made, he doesn't give the full historical context to those Quranic verses. The historical context for those verses is found in Tafsir al-Tabari, Tafsir Ibn Abbas, Ibn Kathir, al-Qurtubi, etc. Those verses that David brings up are denying specific miracles of specific disbelievers because they're still not going to believe even if they get those miracles. We read a similar situation in the New Testament. John the Baptist, according to the Gospel of John chapter 10 verse 4, John the Baptist did not perform miracles. Jesus says no miracles will be given to the Pharisees in Matthew chapter 28 verses 38 to 40, Matthew 16, Mark chapter 8 verse 14. Now notice how Jesus is saying no sign or no miracle is going to be given to the Pharisees or the Jews around Jesus in the Gospel of Matthew and Mark. So does this mean that Jesus never performed miracles? No, because Jesus is denying specific miracles to the Pharisees. So the same logic goes with the Quran. Now, getting to the Quran, chapter 50, there's one place where the Prophet Muhammad performed the miracle of the splitting of the moon, and we read it in Quran chapter 54, verses 1 to 3. This verse is talking about the past tense and not the future. So the Arabic is in the past tense, implying or saying the moon was split in the past. Also notice he brings up Halim, but Halim admits that the Arabic in the Quran chapter 54 verses 1 to 2 is talking about the past tense, saying that the moon was already split in the past during the Prophet Muhammad's time, or during the time the Quran chapter 54 was revealed. The correct translation is, the hour has drawn near and the moon was split in two in the Quran chapter 54 verse 1. And I'm using the translation by Dr. Mustafa Khattab, the Clear Quran. So he translated it in the past tense. Notice what the verse says, and the moon was split in two. That means it happened in the past and is not talking about the future. Further, we need proper tools to understand historical context of the Quran, just like we need proper tools to understand historical context of Bible verses. We read from the most renowned and classical Muslim commentator of the Quran is Ibn Kathir. Ibn Kathir is well respected. Even non-Muslim, even Christian critics of Islam use Ibn Kathir to understand historical context of Quranic verses. Ibn Kathir in his Tafsir Ibn Kathir on Quran chapter 54, that these verses of the Quran chapter 54, verses 1 to 3, refer to the miracle of the Prophet Muhammad of him splitting the moon in front of the disbelieving Meccans. So Ibn Kathir admits that the Quran, Ibn Kathir says, or the historical context of the Quran chapter 54, Ibn Kathir writes that that it's talking about the splitting of the moon as a miracle of the Prophet Muhammad. The references that say the Prophet Muhammad performed the miracle of splitting of the moon of the Quran, and that's the historical context of Quran chapter 54 would be. So if you read the historical context of the Quran chapter 54 verses 1 to 3 would be found, or why these verses were revealed is found in Tafsir Ibn Kathir, or what these verses are talking about is found in Tafsir Ibn Kathir on the Quran chapter 54 verses 1 to 3. It says it was one of the clear miracles that Allah gave the Prophet Muhammad. So the splitting of the moon is the miracle that the Quran chapter 54 verses 1 to 3 is talking about, according to Ibn Kathir, and it was one of the clear miracles Allah gave the Prophet Muhammad. So that means that according to the most renowned and classical and well-respected Sunni commentator on the Quran, Ibn Kathir is writing, or he's talking about the historical context, being that the historical context of the Quran chapter 54 was the miracle of the Prophet Muhammad splitting the moon in half. The Hadith are some of the most authentic and reliable biography sources of the Prophet Muhammad. So even Christian and atheist critics have to go to Sahih Bukhari to understand certain Quranic verses, or understand certain historical context to Quranic verses. The Hadith found in Bukhari and Muslim confirm that the Quran chapter 54 verses 1 to 2 was a miracle of the Prophet Muhammad, in the correct historical context of the Quran chapter 54 verse 1 to 3 is that the Prophet Muhammad split the moon in front of the disbelieving Meccans when they kept asking for a miracle, and that is the correct historical context, or the reason why the Quran chapter 54 verses 1 to 3 was revealed. And we read this in Sahih Bukhari 4867 and Sahih Muslim 2802. So the Prophet Muhammad performed miracles according to the most authentic sources of Islam, which is Sahih Bukhari and Sahih Muslim. And these are you can see the references on the screen there. And the historical context of the Quran chapter 54, according to Sahih Muslim and Sahih Bukhari, was the miracle of the Prophet Muhammad showed the Meccans of the splitting of the moon. So the conclusion we can see here is that the historical context of the Quran chapter 54 is talking about, according to Ibn Kathir, Sahih al-Bukhari, Sahih Muslim, it's talking about the splitting of the moon miracle that the Prophet Muhammad performed when the Meccans were asking him for a miracle. So the conclusion we can draw here is that the Prophet Muhammad performed miracles according to the Quran, chapter 54, the Tafsir of Ibn Kathir, which records much earlier material, which records a material from the first three generations, or from the disciples or the companions of the Prophet Muhammad. So Ibn Kathir didn't come 700 years later. Ibn Kathir was collecting written and oral traditions dating back all the way back to the Prophet Muhammad and the Prophet Muhammad's disciples or companions in the Hadith. So Prophet Muhammad performed miracles according to the Quran, Tafsir Ibn Kathir, and the Hadith of Sahih Bukhari, Sahih Muslim. David Wood just took those Quranic verses out of their historical contexts, because all those verses David Wood cites in his video, Moment's Miracle Problem, he doesn't give any kind of historical context. He just reads the plain reading of the text and says, well, the pagans were accusing the Prophet Muhammad of performing no miracles, but he doesn't give the historical context to those verses, because if you go back, if you watch his video, David Wood's video, he doesn't give a historical. None of those verses, except for the Quran chapter 54 and the Quran 17, he doesn't give a historical context to those verses. The historical context is talking about is those Quranic verses are denying specific miracles to specific groups of disbelievers. But none of those verses say the Prophet Muhammad never performed miracles in the past tense. Also, the Quran chapter 17, if you read Tafsir Ibn Kathir, it's talking about the miracle of the Prophet Muhammad taking a night flight from Mecca to Jerusalem to the heavens. So the Quran chapter 17 is also talking about a miracle according to according to Tafsir Ibn Kathir. But I didn't really want to talk about that. I didn't want to really go into details about the Quran chapter 17 in this video. I just wanted to focus on the miracle of the splitting of the moon. But the Quran chapter 17 is talking about a physical miracle of the Prophet Muhammad going all the way from Mecca to Jerusalem to the heavens and back. And that's the proper historical context of the Quran chapter 17, verses 1 to 2, etc. And David Wood cites Ibn Ishaq, but again, like I said, Ibn Ishaq is not, to say it's some kind of vision, but Ibn Ishaq is not reliable, as I've said hundreds of times on my channel. No need to reinvent the wheel of the reliability of Ibn Ishaq on this channel. So David Wood fails to show that the Quran says Prophet Muhammad performed no miracles.